Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Chapter 14, verse 11. We're still on verse 10, verse 11. We're still on these psukim. They have one pasuk says Jewish people see the Egyptians behind them and the sea in front of them, and they daven. And the very next pasuk says the Jewish people turn to Moshe and they say, "What? Were there not enough graves in Egypt?" So how do we reconcile these two psukim? So the Ramban's pshat, if you remember, was that these were two different groups of Klal Yisrael. Some people davened and some people complained. And he says it's quite striking. Then in verse 10, it refers to them as Bnei Yisrael, which connotes the spiritual elite of the people. And then in verse 11, it talks about, elsewhere it talks about the Am, the nation, which implies the masses. Continuing in this Ramban, it could be that you have it under Pasuk Yud or Pasuk Yud Aleph. It's about 15 lines into the Ramban. He makes a point. The complainers don't say you took us to die at war, even though that seems that's what's going to be about what's going to happen. They keep on talking about in verse 11 and verse 12, dying in the desert. It's very interesting. The Ramban says that what this segment of the people is revealing is that they had their reservations before leaving Egypt. In other words, this is a confirmation of their concerns. They didn't know if they were going to die at war in the desert, but they did think they were going to die in the desert out of famine or out of thirst. So they said this is a confirmation of what we were thinking the whole time. But say some. And the Ramban says, it's interesting. If you look at verse 12, it says, this is what we told you about. Where does it say? Show me the pasuk. Show me the pasuk when they were in Egypt that they said, we don't think it's a good idea to go into the desert. So is it possible that they're just telling a tall tale? It's very possible they're telling a tall tale. But the Ramban says it's also possible that they did say these things to him. Torah doesn't recount every conversation. Maybe they said these things to him, and now they're saying this is what we were talking about. The Efsher Od Lomar, Ki Hayu Ha'am Maminim Bashem, Umispalim Love Latzium. So this was all shot number one. The different segments of the people felt different ways. Another possibility, says the Ramban, is that the people believed in God, and they davened to Hashem to save them. Aval b'Moshe nichnas safik b'libam. You know who they're not so sure about? Moshe. Pen Yotziim Limshol Aleim. Maybe this is a ridiculous thing that he's doing because he wants to govern over them, rule over them. How could they say that about Moshe? They saw that he had miraculous signs. Obviously, he's God's representative. Maybe he's some scientific whiz. Or maybe the plagues are from Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu is God's emissary, but maybe God's involvement is to punish the Egyptians. Maybe God doesn't have a plan to take the Jews out of Egypt. Maybe he just wants to punish the Egyptians. And Moshe Rabbeinu is hijacking this message. Maybe that's what's happening. Because, says the Ramban, they're thinking to themselves, if God wanted us out of Egypt, we see God is all powerful. If God wanted us out of Egypt, how in the world could the Egyptians be chasing us now? So it must be, so we believe in God, but it must be there's something here that's not what God wanted. Moshe, why did we follow you into the desert? Maybe God would just want to punish the Egyptians. Maybe we're supposed to keep on living in Egypt in a better arrangement. Maybe that was what was supposed to happen. That's shot number 2. So it's possible to daven and to question Moshe. Unkelis has a very interesting pshat. He, at least the way the Ramban is understanding Unkelis, he explains that Vayitzaku v'nei Yisrael el Hashem in verse 10, that the way we translate it is the Jewish people cried out to God, doesn't necessarily mean they cried out to God. It might mean they cried at God or shouted at God. They were complaining to God. They complained to God, they complained to Moshe. It's consistent. They're complaining against everybody. Maybe the pshat is not that they davened. They're complaining to God. Why'd you take us out of Egypt? Kushon vayitzaku al paro lemor lama sasecho. You have other elsewhere. Vayitzaku means complaining. So that's pshat number 3. Pshat number 4. Ubemechilta vayitzaku. Skipping a line or two. Tafsu lahem umnas avosei. So the Medrash says they cried out to God. They're following in the ways of their earlier generations. You daven if you have problems. Then they say to Moshe, were there not enough graves in Egypt? Once they got doubts, then they really speak very aggressively to Moshe. The first thing in verse 10 the Jewish people do is they daven, Hashem, please make Paro turn around. But then they see that Paro keeps on coming closer. Az Amru, then they said, you know what? Obviously our prayers weren't answered. We davened. We had a prayer session. We waited 20 seconds. And the salvation didn't come. And then they began suspecting Moshe that his leadership wasn't correct. So I believe we have 4 pshatim. Pshat number 1 is different segments to different things. Pshat number 2 is they believed wholeheartedly in God. Everybody believed in God, but they had suspicions about Moshe. Pshat number 3 is they weren't davening to God. They were complaining against God. They were complaining against God. They were complaining against Moshe. And pshat number 4 is they were davening wholeheartedly, but then their tefillos weren't answered. So then they started complaining. Okay, let's go on now to verse 13. What does Moshe respond to all of this? Vayomer Moshe lo tiro. Moshe said to the people, don't be afraid. Hisyatzvu, stand. Uru'as yeshuas Hashem, asher yaseh lochem hayom. See the salvation that God will bring for you today. Ki asher risemes Mitzrayim hayom. You've seen the Egyptians today. Lo sosifu lirosam od ad olam. You will not see them anymore. It's an interesting end of the pasuk. He says God's going to help you. What does it mean? You're not going to see them anymore. So very interesting Ramban over here. Ramban on pasuk Yud Gimel. Ki asher risemes Mitzrayim hayom lo sosifu lirosam od ad olam. Das Rabosenu harezu mitzvahs lo sase ladoros. The rabbis teach this is actually a prohibition. Moshe's not saying, according to the Medrash, don't worry, you're not going to see them again. He's giving them an instruction. You're not supposed to see the Egyptians anymore after this. If that's the pshat, then what the pasuk is saying is, Al tiro, don't be afraid. Hisyatzvu bimkomchem, stand where you are. Uru'as yeshuas Hashem, sheyoshiaschem hayom miyadam. You're going to see God's going to save you today from the Egyptians. V'al tashuvu lavodasam. Do not turn back. That's what he's saying, according to the Medrash. It's not just, don't worry, you're never going to have to worry about these people again. It's in your hands. God's going to protect you. Don't walk back towards Egypt. Ki Mitzrayim asher risem osam hayom. Do you see the Egyptians today? HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitzaveh eschem od shelo sosifu birtzoncham lirosam be'atav yad olam. God is commanding you, do not engage with them anymore. V'tia mitzvah mipi Moshe liYisrael v'lo husker lamala. This is the first mention of such a thing, of an instruction to the Jews. You're not allowed to go back to the Egyptians. And the Medrash is saying that this is an eternal mitzvah. V'chein lo yashuvas ha'am Mitzrayim l'man harbo sus. This is like this famous idea that the king is not supposed to bring the Jews back to Egypt to get more horses, right? This is from much later in the Chumash. So that's how the Ramban is explaining this statement of Moshe. It's a command, it's an instruction. Very interesting. Just want to see the Orach Chaim. I believe it's the third Orach Chaim on this pasuk. At least that's the breakdown in mine. It's third Orach Chaim on pasuk Yud Gimel. Asher risemes Mitzrayim. Kavanas ma'amer zeh. Says the Orach Chaim. The intent of this phrase is Efshar. It's possible that he's trying to calm them down. Then he's saying to them as follows, he says, that which you see the Egyptians today, the reason why you're seeing them today is because you're not going to see them anymore after this. This is a blessing waiting to blossom. The reason why God brought them your way is because he wants you to see that they're going to be destroyed. It's a fascinating thing that Moshe Rabbeinu was saying to them. You're scared. I'm telling you, just wait a little bit longer. You're going to see that their coming is not something to be frightened about. It's God's continuing to run the world. You know, if you would have just fled from the Egyptians and they wouldn't have followed you, you'd always be looking over your shoulder. Maybe tomorrow they're going to catch up to you. Maybe tomorrow they're going to send a party. No, God sent the Egyptians after you, and now they're going to die in front of you. And now you're going to know there's nothing else to worry about ever again. Very interesting shot. Okay, let's now go to verse 15. So remember, Moshe Rabbeinu tells the Jewish people, don't worry, it's all going to be good. And now in verse 15, Vayomer Hashem Moshe, Ma titzak Eloi. Hashem said to Moshe, what are you shouting to me for? Daber b'nei Yisrael v'yisau. Speak to the Jewish people, and they will go. This pasuk is very difficult to understand. It sounds like he's criticizing Moshe. It sounds like, by the way, it sounds like he's criticizing Moshe. What's Moshe supposed to do? They're stuck. Second, where did it say that Moshe cried out to God? It didn't say that. It said the Jewish people cried out to God. But why are you crying out to me is in the singular, not in the plural. So what's Hashem even talking about? What's the criticism of Moshe, if it is a criticism? What's going on? Ramban, Pasuk Tesvav. Ma titzak Elai. Amar Reb Avram. Ki Moshe keneged kol Yisrael. Says the Ibn Ezra that when God says to Moshe, why are you shouting to me? Moshe is acting as the proxy for the Jewish people, meaning God is really saying, why are the Jewish people shouting to me? Shayu tzoakim lo. As we said, the Jewish people were crying out to God. Cain, lama amar ma titzak, v'roi lahem litzok. So is that really, God is saying to the Jewish people, I don't know why you people are davening. Why would he say, I don't know why you people are davening? We seem to be pro-davening. V'ula yomar ma tanichem litzok. Maybe the pshat is, why are you just leaving them to daven? Daber lahem v'yisau. Tell them that they just need to go. Because I already gave you this answer. Because I said to you earlier in this parsha, I'll be glorified in Paro's downfall. So you know something great is going to happen. So what are you having the Tehillim sessions for? It's time to go. That is the first possibility based on the Ibn Ezra. We're going to talk more about this tomorrow, God willing. So we spoke about some other ideas in terms of reconciling the davening and the complaining when they're facing the sea on one side, the Egyptians on the other. We also spoke about the Ramban and the Orach Chaim as to what Moshe Rabbeinu is saying. You know, you're not going to see them anymore. I see there's a chat. I'm very sorry. I just have to run today. So if you could hold it for tomorrow, I'm happy to discuss tomorrow if you'd like. Okay, be well, everybody. Take care.